The wind howled through the narrow streets of the city, biting at anyone unlucky enough to be outside. It was the kind of cold that didn't just touch your skin, it felt like it went all the way to your bones. For most people, this was a night to stay indoors, to lock the windows and turn up the heat. But for the girl walking alone on the sidewalk, there was no indoors to go to. She had no home, no warm bed, and no one waiting for her. Her name was Illyra, though nobody had called her that in a long time. To the world, she was just another face in the crowd, someone to look past or step over. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her body, trying to keep whatever little heat she had left inside. It wasn't working. The coat was old and full of holes, offering about as much protection as a paper towel. Her shoes were even worse. The soles were worn so thin that she could feel every crack and bump in the freezing pavement. Illyra hadn't eaten in 2 days. The hunger was no longer just a rumble in her stomach, it was a sharp, constant pain that made it hard to think. Her head felt light, and her vision blurred every time she stood up too fast. She knew she needed to find something, anything, to put in her mouth. Even a small piece of bread would have felt like a feast at this point. She walked past shop windows filled with bright lights and expensive things. Inside, she could see people laughing, drinking hot coffee, and eating warm meals. They looked so happy and comfortable. It felt like there was an invisible wall between them and her. They were in a different world, a warm and safe world, and she was locked out in the cold. Eventually, the smell of food stopped her in her tracks. It was the richest, most wonderful smell she had ever encountered: roasted garlic, butter, fresh bread, and spices. It was coming from a large building up ahead. The sign above the door read "The Gilded Fork." It was a fancy restaurant, the kind of place where the waiters wore bow ties and the napkins were made of real cloth. Illyra stood on the corner for a long time, just watching the people go in and out. She knew she didn't belong there. She knew what people thought when they saw someone like her. They saw dirt. They saw trouble. They saw someone who should be ignored. But the hunger was stronger than her pride. It was stronger than her fear. She realized she had a choice: keep walking and maybe faint from hunger in an alley somewhere, or take a chance. She looked at her hands. They were shaking from the cold, but underneath the dirt and grime, her fingers were long and slender. She remembered what her mother used to tell her, a lifetime ago before everything went wrong. Her mother had said her hands were made for magic, that she had a gift that could move people. Illyra hadn't touched a piano in years, but she knew the feeling of the keys was still buried somewhere in her muscle memory. She took a deep breath of the freezing air and stepped toward the restaurant. The big glass doors were heavy. When she pulled on the handle, a rush of warm air hit her face, smelling like heaven. She stepped inside, and the noise of the wind was replaced by the clinking of silverware, soft music, and the low hum of conversation. The change in temperature was shocking. One moment she was freezing, and the next, she was standing in a room that was perfectly heated. But despite the warmth, Illyra felt a sudden chill run down her spine. The atmosphere inside was completely different from the street. It was quiet, elegant, and peaceful. And she, with her dirty coat and messy hair, was like a stain on a clean painting. As soon as the door closed behind her, the room seemed to get quieter. People sitting at the tables near the front stopped talking. They turned their heads to look at her. She saw a woman in an expensive dress wrinkle her nose in disgust. A man in a suit looked her up and down, then quickly looked away, as if seeing her might ruin his appetite. Illyra's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt small. She felt invisible. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around and run back into the snow. But then, her stomach gave a loud, painful growl. It reminded her why she was there. She clenched her fists to stop her hands from shaking and walked further into the room. The carpet on the floor was thick and soft, swallowing the sound of her worn-out shoes. She walked slowly, feeling dozens of eyes on her. She felt like she was walking through a dream where she didn't know the rules. She saw waiters carrying silver trays with food that looked more colorful than anything she had seen in years. She saw glasses filled with red wine and sparkling water. It was a world of plenty, and she had nothing. She reached the center of the room and stopped. She didn't know who to talk to. She just stood there, looking around helplessly. The noise level in the room had dropped significantly. The background music seemed to get louder, making the silence of the customers even more obvious. They weren't just ignoring her now, they were watching her, waiting to see what this beggar would do. Ilora felt her face get hot with shame. She knew she looked terrible. She could feel the dirt on her face and the tangles in her hair. She wished she could disappear. But she couldn't. She was here, and she was hungry. She looked toward the back of the restaurant and saw it. Standing in the corner, bathed in a soft, golden light from a chandelier above, was a grand piano. It was black and shiny, looking like a sleek, sleeping beast. It was beautiful. Seeing it brought a lump to her throat. It had been so long since she had seen a piano that wasn't broken or covered in dust. For a second, Ilora forgot about the people staring at her. She forgot about her dirty clothes and her empty stomach. She just stared at the instrument. It looked like a lifeboat floating in a dark ocean. She didn't know if the piano was just for decoration or if anyone was allowed to play it, but she knew she had to try. She took another step forward, her eyes locked on the piano. She knew the manager or the waiters would stop her soon. She knew she might get thrown out into the snow. But looking at that piano gave her a tiny spark of courage. It was a spark of the person she used to be, the person who had dignity and talent. The room was waiting. The air was thick with judgment. The smell of the food was intoxicating. Ilora took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was about to happen. She knew she was about to make a scene. She knew that asking for food in a place like this was almost a crime. But she had run out of options. She was going to ask, and she was going to hope that somewhere in this room, behind all the expensive clothes and cold stares, there was a little bit of kindness left. The tall man in the crisp suit walked toward her with fast, heavy steps. He didn't look happy. This was Henry, the manager who took great pride in keeping his restaurant perfect. To him, Ilora wasn't a person, she was a problem that needed to be fixed immediately. She could see the anger in his eyes, but she also saw something else: disgust. He looked at her dirty coat as if it were contagious. He stopped right in front of her, blocking her path, and crossed his arms. "Excuse me," Henry said, his voice loud enough for the people at the nearest tables to hear. He didn't shout, but his tone was sharp and cold, like a slap in the face. "You cannot be here. This is a private place for paying customers. You need to leave." Ilora felt her heart sink, but she stood her ground. She looked up at him. He was so tall and clean, and she felt so small and dirty. She knew she didn't belong here, but she was desperate. The smell of the food was making her mouth water, and the pain in her stomach was getting worse. She couldn't just walk back out into the cold snow. She wouldn't survive the night if she did. "I don't have any money," Ilora said. Her voice shook a little, but she tried to make it sound strong. I haven't eaten in 2 days. Please, I'm not asking for money. I just need food. Henry shook his head. He wasn't interested in her story. He had heard it all before, or at least he thought he had. He just wanted her gone. We are not a charity, he snapped. If you need help, go to a shelter. Now, please go, before I have to make you leave. A few people nearby were listening now. They were whispering to each other. Illyra could feel their eyes on her back. It made her skin crawl. She knew she had to offer something. She had to give them a reason to let her stay. Her eyes darted back to the corner of the room where the grand piano sat silently. I can see the piano over there, Illyra said, pointing a shaking finger toward the instrument. I can play. If you let me play a song for you and your guests, will you give me a meal, just a bowl of soup? Anything. The moment the words left her mouth, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. It wasn't just a request anymore, it was becoming a spectacle. Henry looked at her like she had just told a very unfunny joke. He raised an eyebrow and let out a short, cruel laugh. You, he asked, looking her up and down. Play that piano. Do you have any idea where that instrument came from? It is a masterpiece. It is for professional artists, not for... He waved his hand at her dirty clothes, not even finishing the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone knew what he meant. Not for people like you. Henry turned slightly to look at a table of wealthy men sitting nearby. They were drinking expensive wine and laughing. Did you hear this? Henry said to them, a mocking smile on his face. She wants to play the piano. For soup. The men at the table laughed. It was a cruel sound. One of them, a man with a gray beard and a gold watch on his wrist, wiped his mouth with a napkin and smirked. This should be good, he said loud enough for Illyra to hear. I haven't heard a street performance in a long time. Another woman at a different table giggled behind her hand. She looked at Illyra with a mix of pity and amusement. Oh, let her play, Henry, she said in a playful voice. It might be entertaining. It's been a boring night anyway. The mockery hung in the air like smoke. Illyra felt her face burn with embarrassment. She knew they were laughing at her. They were expecting her to make a fool of herself. They thought she was going to bang on the keys like a child, or maybe try to play a silly song and fail. They saw her as a clown, something to laugh at while they finished their expensive dinners. Henry looked back at Illyra. He saw the shame in her eyes, but he didn't care. He wanted to show her who was in charge. He wanted to prove that she didn't belong in his world. All right, he said, crossing his arms again. You want to play? Go ahead. But let me tell you, if you make one wrong note, if you sound terrible, you are out of here immediately. No food, no second chances. Illyra nodded. She didn't care about their laughter anymore. She didn't care about their smug faces. She saw an opportunity. It was a small chance, a tiny door opening in a brick wall, but she had to walk through it. Okay, she whispered. I will play. Henry stepped aside and gestured toward the piano with a sweeping, sarcastic bow, like he was introducing a famous musician to a king, but he was doing it to mock her. After you, maestro, he said, chuckling. Illyra took a deep breath. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her as she began to walk toward the piano. It felt like the longest walk of her life. The carpet was soft under her worn-out shoes, but every step felt heavy. She could hear the whispers following her. Look at her hands, someone whispered. They are filthy. Do you think she even knows how to read music? Another voice asked. Ilora kept her head down, watching her feet move. She tried to block out the voices. She tried to block out the laughter. She focused entirely on the black and white keys waiting for her in the corner of the room. The piano seemed to glow in the dim light. It looked majestic. She reached the bench and paused for a moment. The wood of the piano was smooth and polished. It smelled of lemon oil and dust. It was a beautiful smell. For a second, she was transported back to her childhood. She remembered sitting on a bench just like this, her feet dangling in the air, her teacher guiding her hands. She remembered the feeling of power she had when she played, the feeling that she could create something beautiful out of silence. She sat down slowly. The bench was cold against her legs. The restaurant was noisy, glasses clinking, forks scraping on plates, people talking, but as Ilora placed her hands on the keys, a strange quiet began to spread. It wasn't a silence of peace, it was a silence of anticipation. The people dining were watching her like hawks. They had their forks ready, waiting to mock her. They were expecting a disaster. The man with the gold watch had even turned his chair around to get a better view. He had a cruel smile on his face, as if he was already preparing a joke to tell his friends tomorrow. Ilora looked at her hands. They were trembling slightly. The skin was dry and cracked, and the nails were bitten down to the quick. They looked like the hands of a worker, not a musician. But she knew what they could do. She closed her eyes for a brief second and took a deep, steadying breath. She blocked out the image of the restaurant, the fancy clothes, and the judging eyes. She thought about the cold wind outside. She thought about the empty ache in her stomach. She thought about the long, lonely years she had spent on the streets. All that pain, all that loneliness, was trapped inside her. She had to let it out. She didn't pick a simple song. She didn't pick a happy tune to make people smile. She chose something difficult. She chose something fierce. She positioned her fingers over the keys, feeling the cold ivory beneath her fingertips. The laughter from the tables had faded down to a few low chuckles. They were waiting. Ilora took one last breath. She wasn't just playing for food anymore. She was playing for her dignity. She was playing to show them that she was more than just a dirty coat on the street. She pressed down the first key. The moment her fingers made contact with the keys, a strange thing happened. The air in the room seemed to tighten, like a bowstring being pulled back. Ilora didn't start with a soft, gentle melody. She didn't try to ease the audience into it. Instead, she struck the keys with a force that surprised everyone, including herself. The sound wasn't a clumsy bang, it was a thunderous, perfectly tuned chord that seemed to cut through the clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation like a knife through warm butter. For the first split second, nobody reacted. They were too confused. They had expected a mess of noise, a child's random plinking, or perhaps a butchered version of a popular song. But this sound was rich, deep, and incredibly loud. It vibrated through the floorboards and up the legs of the tables. The man with the gold watch, who had been smirking just moments ago, froze with his wine glass halfway to his lips. His eyes widened as the first note hung in the air, ringing with a clarity that demanded attention. Ilora didn't wait for them to catch up. Her hands, which had been trembling from the cold and hunger just moments before, suddenly found a life of their own. It was as if the piano was waking up from a long sleep and was using her hands to speak. She launched into a piece of music that was technically difficult and emotionally heavy. It was a storm of sound, full of sharp, fast runs and heavy, crashing chords. The reaction was immediate. The low murmurs and giggles that had filled the room vanished instantly, replaced by a stunned, almost uncomfortable silence. It wasn't a polite silence, it was the kind of silence that happens when people realize they have made a terrible mistake. They realized they weren't watching a joke, they were witnessing something intense. The wealthy diners turned in their chairs, their expressions shifting from amusement to shock. A woman near the window, who had been whispering about Illyra's dirty coat, stopped chewing. She just stared, her mouth slightly open, completely forgetting about the expensive food on her plate. The waiters, who had been walking around with trays held high, stopped in their tracks. They stood frozen like statues, afraid that even the sound of their shoes on the carpet might disturb the music. Illyra couldn't see any of this. Her eyes were closed, squeezed tight as she focused entirely on the instrument. She was no longer in a restaurant. She wasn't the hungry girl in the rags anymore. In her mind, she was somewhere else entirely. She remembered the music she used to play when she was young and happy, but she was mixing it with the pain she felt now. She was pouring her hunger, her cold nights, and her loneliness into the keys. Every time her hands moved faster, it was like she was running from her past. Every heavy chord was a cry of frustration. The music was complex. Her right hand moved in a blur, playing intricate patterns that seemed to weave together like magic. Her left hand provided a powerful, rhythmic bass that shook the chest of anyone listening. It was a classical piece, something that belonged in a grand concert hall, not a dining room, but she was playing it with a raw, rough energy that you would never hear from a polished professional in a tuxedo. The man at the table in the corner finally lowered his glass. He looked at his friends, but they weren't looking at him. They were all staring at the piano. He looked back at Illyra. The mocking smile was gone, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. He could see the intensity on her face. She was sweating now, despite the cold air outside, and her face was flushed red. She was fighting the piano, battling with the music, and winning. There was a moment in the song where the tempo slowed down. The fast, chaotic notes melted into a slow, sad melody that felt like a tear rolling down a cheek. The room became so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the soda glasses. It was heartbreaking. The sadness in the tune was something everyone could feel, regardless of how much money they had. It was a universal language of pain and longing. A young woman near the back felt a sudden lump in her throat and had to blink away tears. She didn't know why, but the music made her think of her own struggles, things she hadn't thought about in years. Illyra's hands were dancing across the ivory keys. The contrast was striking. Her hands looked rough and damaged, with dirt ingrained in the lines of her palms, but they moved with the grace of a swan. It was a visual illusion. If you closed your eyes, you would imagine a wealthy pianist sitting on a velvet bench. If you opened your eyes, you saw a homeless woman fighting for her dignity. The manager, Henry, was standing near the front desk. He had crossed his arms, ready to signal security to drag her out the moment she messed up. But his arms had slowly dropped to his sides. He stood there, feeling a cold chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. He looked at the customers. They weren't eating anymore. They weren't drinking. They were completely captivated. He realized that if he stopped her now, they wouldn't be relieved, they would be angry. He had been ready to humiliate her, but instead, she was making his restaurant feel like a sacred place. The music began to build up again. The slow sadness turned into a rising tide of sound. It grew louder and faster, climbing toward a climax. The tension in the room became almost physical. People leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the storm coming from the corner. The sound of the piano filled every corner of the large room, bouncing off the walls and ceiling. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. Elora didn't hold back. She hit the keys with everything she had left. She played the low notes with such force that the piano seemed to groan under the pressure, but the sound was glorious. It was powerful and strong. She was showing them that she was small, but her spirit was huge. She was telling them that they might have money and warm coats, but in this moment, she had the power. The judgmental stares from earlier were completely gone. No one was looking at her hair or her shoes anymore. They were looking at her hands, her face, and her soul. They were seeing a human being who had been through hell and was still able to create beauty. The invisible wall between the rich diners and the poor homeless girl was shattering, note by note. As the music reached its peak, a shiver went through the entire room. It was a moment of pure magic. The music was so fast and loud that it sounded like rain pounding on a metal roof, but it was organized and perfect. Elora's fingers were a blur. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling with the effort, but she didn't stop. She was driven by something deep inside, a desperate need to be heard, to prove that she existed. The restaurant staff stopped wiping tables. The cooks popped their heads out of the kitchen door, wondering what was happening in the dining area. Even they, busy with their hot stoves and orders, stopped to listen. It wasn't just music anymore, it was a story. It was a story of survival. Elora felt the energy of the room change. Before, it had felt hostile and cold. Now, it felt electric. The energy from the audience was flowing into her. She could feel their shock turning into respect. It gave her a burst of strength. She played the most difficult part of the song, a section that required her left hand to jump across the keys while her right hand played a melody that seemed to float in the air. She didn't miss a single note. It was flawless. The people watching were holding their breath without even realizing it. A man who had been texting on his phone put it down on the table, screen first. He didn't care about the email anymore. He couldn't look away. The music was demanding his full attention, and it was getting it. Elora was in a trance. The hunger, the cold, the shame, it all faded away until there was nothing left but the music. She wasn't thinking about what would happen when the song ended. She wasn't thinking about whether they would give her food. She was just playing. It was the first time in years that she felt truly alive. She felt like she was flying, and the piano was her wings. The grand instrument, which had sat silently in the corner for so long, was finally singing, and its voice was the voice of an angel who had fallen into the mud and was trying to climb back out. The storm of sound that Elora had created was starting to change. The fast, angry notes that had filled the room like heavy rain were slowing down. She was moving toward the end of the piece, and the music was becoming deeper, more emotional, and incredibly soft. It was strange how the silence in the room had grown even heavier than before. It wasn't an empty silence, it was a waiting silence, like the whole world was holding its breath to see what she would do next. Elora's fingers were not just hitting keys anymore, they were caressing them. She played a sequence of notes that were so high and delicate they sounded like crystal bells ringing in the distance. The melody was heartbreaking. It wasn't a sad sound that made you want to cry because it was painful, it was a sad sound that made you feel understood. It felt like the piano was telling the story of every person in that room who had ever been lonely, or who had ever lost something they loved. The people watching were completely mesmerized. The man who had been laughing the loudest, the one with the expensive suit and the gold watch, was now sitting very still. He had a look on his face that was hard to describe. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was staring at Ellora's hands, watching them fly across the keyboard with a skill that shouldn't belong to a homeless woman. His glass of wine sat forgotten on the white tablecloth. He looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle in his head. He couldn't understand how someone who looked like she had nothing could possess something so precious and powerful. Near the window, a young couple on a date stopped holding hands. They weren't looking at the menu, and they weren't looking at each other. They were just listening. The girl in the red dress had tears in her eyes. She didn't wipe them away. The music was touching a part of her heart that she usually kept locked up tight. It reminded her of a lullaby her grandmother used to sing, a memory she hadn't thought about in years. The music had that power. It crawled past all the walls people put up and spoke directly to their feelings. Ellora didn't know about the tears or the shock. She was lost in her own world. As she played the final passages of the song, she felt a strange sensation. It started in her stomach, a warm feeling that had nothing to do with food. It was a feeling of release. For years, she had been carrying a heavy backpack of invisible weights: shame, fear, hunger, and the feeling of being invisible. As she played, it felt like she was taking that backpack off and dropping it on the floor. Every note she played was a weight being lifted. The physical toll was starting to show, though. Ellora was sweating now. Her hair was sticking to her forehead. Her hands were moving so fast they were almost a blur, but she was getting tired. Her arms ached. But she knew she couldn't stop. Not yet. She had to play the ending perfectly. It was the most important part. She had to show them that she wasn't just lucky or a one-time wonder. She had to show them she was a master. She reached the climax of the song, the moment where the music seems to explode into a million pieces before it comes back together. Her left hand slammed down on a low chord, creating a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the floor, while her right hand raced to the highest notes. It was a sound of victory. It was a sound that said, "I am here, and you cannot ignore me." The contrast in the room was shocking. Just 10 minutes ago, these people were laughing at her. They saw her as dirt. Now, they were witnessing her soul. The dirty coat, the holes in her shoes, the messy hair, it didn't matter anymore. The beauty of what she was creating washed away all the ugliness of her appearance. The music made her look like a queen. The way she sat, the way she held her posture, the confidence in her movements, it was regal. The golden light from the chandelier above shone down on her, reflecting off the black lacquer of the piano and making her look radiant. Henry, the manager, was standing near the kitchen door. His face had gone pale. He was sweating too, but for a different reason. He was realizing that he had almost thrown a genius out into the snow. He looked around the room and saw that his customers were hypnotized. He knew that if he interrupted now, they would probably walk out and never come back. He felt small. He felt like the fool. He had judged a book by its cover, and now the book was reading him a lesson he would never forget. The music began to slow down again. The chaos turned into order. The racing notes slowed to a walk, and then to a crawl. The volume dropped until it was barely a whisper. Ellora leaned closer to the keys, her hands gently pressing the notes as if she were afraid to break them. The soft melody was the most beautiful thing anyone in the room had ever heard. It was peaceful. It was like the feeling of waking up on a Saturday morning when the sun is streaming through the window and you have nowhere to be. There was a young waiter standing by a pillar, holding a silver tray. He had stopped working completely. He was just a few feet away from the piano. He had grown up in a poor family, and he had worked hard to get this job. He knew what it felt like to be looked down on. Watching Illyra play, he felt a surge of pride in his chest, even though he didn't know her. He felt like she was playing for him. He saw the determination in her eyes, the way she bit her lip as she concentrated on the final notes. She was giving everything she had, leaving every ounce of energy on that bench. It was a pure act of human spirit. Illyra felt the end coming. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might jump out of her chest. She took a deep breath and played the final run, a cascade of notes that tumbled down the keyboard like a waterfall. She ended with a single, resonant chord. She pressed the pedal with her foot, letting the sound ring out into the air. It was a sound that seemed to hang there forever, echoing off the walls, filling every corner of the restaurant. Then, her hands stopped moving. Illyra pulled her hands away from the keys and placed them gently in her lap. She didn't move. She didn't open her eyes right away. She just sat there, letting the silence wash over her. The sound of the piano faded away slowly, getting quieter and quieter until there was nothing left but the memory of the music. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the restaurant moved. It was a complete, frozen silence. No one cleared their throat. No one sipped their drink. No one shifted in their seat. It was as if the music had cast a spell over them, and they were waiting to see if the spell was broken. The contrast between the noise of the restaurant before and this deep silence was shocking. The air felt charged with electricity. Illyra finally opened her eyes. She blinked a few times, adjusting to the light. The rush of the performance was fading, and reality was starting to creep back in. She felt the ache in her shoulders and the cold air touching her sweat. She felt small again. She was afraid to look up. She was afraid that when she looked at the people, the mockery would be back on their faces. She thought maybe they would laugh and say, "Is that it?" or get back to the street. Her hands were shaking again, but this time not from the cold. She took a shaky breath and slowly lifted her head to look at the room. She was ready for the rejection. She was ready to grab her coat and run. But what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. They weren't laughing. They weren't sneering. They were staring at her with wide eyes, filled with tears and disbelief. The man with the gold watch wasn't smirking. He was looking at her with his mouth slightly open, like he was looking at a ghost. The woman near the window had tears streaming down her face. Even Henry, the manager who had tried to kick her out, looked humbled. The barrier was gone. The music had torn it down completely. Illyra realized, with a sudden jolt of surprise, that she had won. She didn't just play a song, she had changed their minds. She had reached them. She sat there, a simple girl in dirty clothes on a fancy piano bench, waiting for the world to start moving again. The silence stretched on for what felt like a lifetime, but it was only a few seconds. It was the kind of heavy silence that happens after something incredible takes place, when nobody is quite sure how to react yet. Illyra sat on the bench, her hands resting on her legs, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She was terrified. She kept her head down, looking at the worn tips of her shoes, afraid to look up and see the scorn on their faces again. She thought maybe they were just quiet because they were shocked, but that the laughter would start any moment. She braced herself for the humiliation, ready to run out the door and back into the snow. But then, a sound broke the silence. It was the slow clap of a single pair of hands. It came from the back of the room. Startled, Illyra looked up. It was an elderly man sitting alone at a small table. He was looking at her with a kind, gentle smile, clapping steadily. His eyes were wet, as if he had just witnessed a miracle. That single clap acted like a spark in a dry forest. Suddenly, the room erupted. It wasn't just a polite applause, it was a roar. People jumped up from their seats. The man with the gold watch was clapping so hard his face was turning red. The woman near the window was wiping tears from her eyes while clapping enthusiastically. Even the waiters and the kitchen staff were banging on the counters and cheering. The sound was overwhelming. It washed over Illyra like a warm wave. She froze for a moment, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had expected anger or mockery, not this. She had never heard such a noise in her honor. Illyra slowly stood up from the piano bench. Her legs felt weak, like jelly, after sitting still for so long while pouring so much energy into the music. She instinctively tried to pull her ragged coat tighter around herself, feeling exposed under the bright lights and the gaze of so many people. She didn't know what to do. Should she bow, should she run? She felt small and fragile against the grandeur of the room, but the applause made her feel tall at the same time. It was a confusing mix of emotions. The crowd didn't stop. They kept clapping, some people even shouting bravo. An encore. The noise was deafening. Illyra looked toward the front of the room. Through the crowd of standing people, she saw Henry. The manager was standing still, his arms hanging by his sides. He wasn't clapping, but he wasn't looking angry either. He looked like he had seen a ghost. His face was pale, and his eyes were fixed on her with an expression of total shock. The arrogance he had earlier was gone, replaced by a strange kind of respect. He realized he had misjudged her completely. He wasn't looking at a dirty beggar anymore, he was looking at an artist. Henry finally moved. He took a step forward, then another. He walked past the tables of clapping patrons, heading straight for the piano. The crowd parted to let him through. Illyra watched him come, feeling a flash of fear. Maybe he was going to kick her out now that the song was over. She tensed up, ready to defend herself. But Henry didn't yell. When he reached her, he stopped and looked at her for a long moment. Then, to the surprise of everyone watching, he bowed his head slightly. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It was an apology. When he looked up again, his voice was soft, completely different from the harsh tone he had used before. "I am sorry," Henry said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "I was wrong. You have a gift." Illyra just nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. She was still shaking. "Please," Henry said, gesturing toward a table right in the center of the room, the best table in the house. "Sit. You are our guest tonight." The audience cheered even louder at this. A waiter hurried over and pulled the chair out for her. Illyra hesitated. She felt out of place walking across the expensive carpet to sit at a table where a meal for one probably cost more than she had earned in her entire life. But the smell of the food reminded her of her hunger, and the warmth in the room was too tempting to resist. She walked slowly to the table, the applause following her every step. She sat down on the plush velvet chair. It felt like sitting on a cloud. She didn't have to look at a menu. Henry disappeared into the kitchen and came back moments later, followed by the chef. The chef, a big man with a white apron, was carrying a tray himself. He set it down in front of Illyra with great care. It wasn't just a bowl of soup. There was a plate of steaming hot pasta with a rich, creamy sauce, a basket of freshly baked bread still warm from the oven, a plate of roasted chicken, and a glass of cold water. There was even a small dessert, a slice of chocolate cake, on the side. "Eat," the chef said simply, giving her a kind smile. "You need it?" Ilora didn't wait. She picked up a piece of bread and took a bite. It was soft and buttery. As soon as the food touched her tongue, her body reacted instantly. She took another bite, then a forkful of pasta. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. The warm food filled her empty stomach, chasing away the pain and the cold. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time they were happy tears. She ate with the intensity of someone who didn't know when her next meal would come, but she tried to be polite. The room was settling down now. People were sitting back down, but they kept glancing over at her with smiles. While she ate, the atmosphere in the restaurant had completely changed. The cold, snobbish feeling was gone. It felt warmer, more human. People were talking to each other, but they weren't bragging about money or business anymore. They were talking about the music. They were talking about her. The man with the gold watch had called the waiter over, and instead of complaining, he was asking the waiter to bring him his check because he wanted to leave a massive tip for the staff. It was as if Ilora's music had opened their hearts. They weren't just rich people anymore, they were people who had been moved by a moment of pure truth. Ilora finished the chicken and the pasta, scraping the plate to get every last bit of sauce. She drank the water in one long gulp. She felt the energy returning to her body. The fog in her brain cleared. She sat back in the chair, feeling full for the first time in years. She looked around the room. No one was looking away. When she caught someone's eye, they smiled at her. It was a respect she had never felt before. It wasn't the fake respect people give to those with money. It was real respect for her talent and her spirit. Henry came back to the table. He looked nervous again, but in a different way. "Miss," he said softly. I don't know where you will go tonight. But if you ever need a meal, or if you want to play, you are welcome here. No charge. Ever." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He placed it on the table next to her dessert. It was thick with cash. "This is from the house," he whispered. "And the customers contributed too." Ilora looked at the envelope, then up at Henry. She was overwhelmed. She had come in asking for bread, and she was leaving with a feast, money, and her dignity restored. She picked up the envelope and put it in her pocket. It felt heavy, but it was a good kind of heavy. It was security. She stood up to leave. The room went quiet again, but this time it was a respectful quiet. As she walked toward the door, people nodded at her. Some reached out to touch her arm as she passed, whispering thank you. She pushed the heavy doors open and stepped back out into the night. The cold wind hit her face, but it didn't bother her anymore. She was still wearing her thin, worn-out coat. She was still homeless. The world outside was still dark and cold. But inside, she felt a fire burning. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had faced a room full of people who judged her, and she had won them over. She had proven to herself that she still had value. As she walked down the street, her footsteps were lighter. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, she was full, she was rich, and she was happy. The music had saved her, just as she knew it always would.